Hey guys, Mark Allen, BHSpringSolutions LLC and BHSpringSolutions.com. We're going to take the step-by-step installing the BH Advanced Trigger Subassembly with Magazine Eject Assist. And we're going to start with removing your high powers current trigger. And I'm going to give you some tips and pointers, and I want to remind everybody that this tutorial sessions are intended for gunsmiths, pistol smiths, and other qualified individuals. And we have put this together to show some tips and pointers and things that's going to make everything go much more smoothly. What I've done is I've staged this hoping to be able to have some color differentiation where possible on the tutorial video. So this combination may look a little bit strange, but we're getting it out of there anyway. What you're going to notice here is I have put some Gorilla tape. You could use masking tape or whatever you want to do, but I've taped up the trigger guard area here because this gets a little tight in some models. This area where you're working, where you're uninstalling and installing a new trigger. So that's the reason for the tape there, is just to protect my finish on that part. Okay, having your frame suspended, such as on these magnets, is an important thing. This pin can really be a challenge to get removed. It's basically mashed in at the factory, and it takes a little bit of coaxing in order to get that out. BHSpringSolutions has a two-step high-power trigger pin removal tool set available at BHSpringSolutions.com. That also comes included with our Masters pin punch tools and our Masters tools kits, all series of Masters tools kits. So anyway, the idea of the step one punch is this is a cupped out or like a nail punch, and what we want to do is fit that over that conical shaped pin, and we want to just go slow. Now the pin I have in here is going to be very, very friendly to me, so it's going to look completely unrealistic, but sometimes this takes some persuasive hits by a hammer to get that pin moved. And what we're looking to do is to get that pin moved at all. And once we've gotten it moved at all, we're going to go to our step two. So I've wailed away at this a little bit, and I've moved the pin at all. Actually, in this case, it's awfully friendly to me. So I'm going to take you through step two. Step two is our pin punch. It's got a cupped out head and a rubber grommet, and we want to just put it down over our pin and take the pin in the rest of the way until the rubber grommet meets the frame. And from here, a 3/32 pin punch is going to take care of that pin the rest of the way out. Okay, now this trigger does have the old magazine disconnect in it. We've got the magazine face right here. I'm going to press in on it, and at the same time I'm going to be manipulating the trigger lever. I'll try to keep this in sight of the camera. It's already out actually, so there we go. It's easy to release that when you release its pressure, the pressure on it on the magazine release like we just did. Now we're going to lift the front of the trigger up and down, and in this case we're going to be pressing on that magazine disconnect, and we'll rotate to the side and it is removed. Now we're ready to get started on the install of the new advanced trigger subassembly, and everything that you just saw come out of there except the trigger pin, everything is going to be not used again. So put that aside, put it in a bag for memories, but the only thing you're going to reuse even possibly is your trigger pin, which will be the mount for the new trigger. Okay, with the original trigger subassembly out of the pistol, this is the time to do a very deep cleaning in this whole area where the new trigger is going to be going, and good tools for doing that. BHSpringSolutions has a professional grade or gunsmith's polishing kit. It's got about 100 different polishing bobs in it, and especially these little ones are extremely handy. One of those with some white polishing compound or finer just down in this area. This is going to be real nice for getting any metal burrs or anything cleaned up, especially in this area where the trigger pawl or trigger lever lives. This area You want to, if you're going to clean just with a patch cloth and maybe some CLP, that's fine, but just you're going to keep going until you don't get any more dirt out of there. We've seen some of these where even a small fine metal file like this into these corners was even necessary in order to get these clean. If you use something like this, be very slow and not using it too heavy, just to get any permanent black stuff or black stuff that's trying to become permanent out of there. And again, the polishing bob down in this entire area will do nice things for the fit and function of the trigger. As a quick orientation to the trigger is composed of your trigger shoe. This one has serrations, and from front to back you have, this is your front stop. This is what limits the pull of the trigger, or the range of the pull rearward of the trigger. This is the hole for your trigger return spring pin. This is the hole for your trigger pin that goes through the frame and mounts the trigger into the handgun. Your trigger return spring pin that goes through here, that's your mounting point for your trigger return spring. And the trigger pin hole and the trigger pin itself is the mounting point for your magazine eject assist spring. And then finally, here in the rear of the trigger, we have the mounting point for the trigger pawl or trigger lever. And finally, at the back end, we have the backstop. So this is the front stop, this is the backstop. The backstop is not really an adjustment point. The front stop is a possible adjustment point, but we've only found one high power clone that ever necessitated a filing of this front stop. If I remember right, it was a Charles Daly, I think. So anyway, there's your orientation to the trigger itself. Okay, back for step 2 of the install of BH Advanced Trigger Subassembly with Magazine Eject Assist. Going to get a little oriented here to the contents in your trigger subassembly. There is also some included literature, and that is all required reading in addition to this tutorial video. We have a trigger, and you're going to want to go ahead and unpackage that. A trigger pawl used to be called a trigger lever with the old OEM trigger, and you'll want to also unpackage that. You've got 4 trigger return springs. Set those aside for a moment. And you have a magazine eject assist spring. One word about this. Magazine eject assist means that this spring is going to help in ejecting your empty magazines. And if you do not use this, and this is not a required spring you have to use, but we're going to assume in this tutorial that you will, it is not a spring that you must use with the advanced trigger subassembly for high powers. So you just know you can go with or without that, but we're going to show you the easy way to fit that. So go ahead and unpackage that, assuming that you're using it. Also, you have 2 pins in a package. At least at the time that we are recording this and introducing this product, we're including 2 pins, and we'll be explaining why. There's a solid pin and a scroll pin. For now, choose the solid pin and unpackage that. And at this point, you have unpackaged everything except the trigger return springs. Set aside everything at this point, and I'm going to focus your attention to the trigger return springs, and also to the literature that was included with your trigger return springs. From this literature, you're going to be able to choose a good starting point among these 4 trigger return springs. The install that we're working with here is on a non-drop safety Sear lever, or type 1 Sear lever model, and that means that the Sear lever here in the slide is basically a straight bar. If it was a drop safety type, you have an open cutout right here, and the Sear lever is a different shape. Also, this Sear lever is completely movable. We call it a floating Sear lever, for better or worse, and but that's what that is, and that's the type that I'm going to be installing in with this tutorial video. We'll also be talking about the Type 2 Sear lever models as we go along. Based on the guidance with the trigger, I'm going to choose the 0.75 trigger return spring. That's where I'm going to start today. I'm going to show you a quick little bit of help for installing this trigger, hopefully a lot of help, and it's going to make it very, very easy for you. And what I'm going to show you is this. Into the trigger return spring is going to install like I'm showing you here. And I've found that on some models it will help me to just take a little bit of length off of the end of the trigger return spring. At the point where I'm installing this way, it helps just to not be having this spring so much in contact with the trigger guard area. Again, in some models, but this video is going to assume that everybody watching this does have a Dremel type tool or a rotary tool. You can pick these up at your big box stores. And here's what I do in order to just give myself a little bit more advantage on that is very simple, very fast, very easy. But what I've done is, you can see, I've went ahead and terminated the spring at the point where it's now kind of pointing parallel with this arm of the spring, and just taken a little bit of length off. It's going to make no difference in how this spring performs whatsoever. The engagement point of this spring on the trigger lever is right about here. And just that little bit is going to just make it a little easier on the install, again, in some models. And the amount of room that you have to work with in this trigger guard area is highly variable, and it's variable between generations of Brownings, a cast frame or forged frame, and in a lot of the clones you'll find more generous amounts of area available to you to work in here, like in your Arcus 94s and some other clones. But doing this is just going to make this just a tad easier for you. So that's what I was showing you right there. Okay, first step in doing this install is, I would like you to just take your trigger without anything else. Take your trigger pin, go ahead and put it through the trigger pin hole like that. And what you're going to do is just see, how is this relationship? Ideally, you want this relationship to be very, very free, like you see it right here. If by chance it is not on your trigger pin, the solution is going to be to polish with a Dremel polishing bob and some polish, and go around this metal pin. That's the easiest way. You can also use a file. It's more aggressive, and you can have a hard time keeping the roundness of the pin so much that way, and usually polish. But it is completely not typical for us to find a relationship problem here. Generally, with all trigger pins that have been used OEM, you're going to find that kind of a good relationship. Okay, next thing I want you to do is, I want you to take your trigger lever, and I want you to see how the trigger lever installs, and practice this a few times before you have to try it in the gun. With the trigger lever angled the way that you're seeing me do it right here, I'm going to take this tip of the trigger lever and I'm going to install it from the inside right in that little hole right there. And this side is going to come into its position. And what I want you to do is, I want you to just notice that this has no problems moving. It's very free, and it's very fluid. If I did have any issues, you know, a little bit of a polishing bob in this area, just going around this, and maybe on this edge here. But again, that's very, very, very rare. But you should find that this goes right in just as you saw. And you're going to notice it is very completely secure, and it cannot come out until it has been rotated down like this and removed. So again, here's your entry install point angle like this, and then it rotates up and it's going to live in this position. Okay, so that you can envision how this works, I have a trigger here with the trigger return spring installed. So when this is properly installed in the firearm, it's going to go just like that. Your trigger return spring engagement point is with the trigger lever on this side. So remember this, when you install, the trigger return spring must be on top of this edge here of the trigger lever. And just like that. It's very easy once you see how it goes together. And so, okay, so there we go. I'm going to lay the trigger lever aside. We don't need a trigger right now with the trigger return spring in it, so I haven't told you to put a trigger return spring in. Don't do that yet. We're going to make keep your life easy here. First thing I want you to do, take a bare trigger and go ahead and snake that up in the trigger guard area and get accustomed to how that goes in, and just like that. Now I have a friendly trigger pin that I'm using for all of this work. If your trigger pin probably fits a lot tighter, but generally you can slide your trigger pin in just about like that. It's all you need to do right now at this point is just have it in like that, but not all the way. And what you're going to be studying here is this. With nothing else going on, do I have a free floating trigger on the trigger pin, and I don't have any issues with tolerance on either side of the trigger? In other words, I don't have any resistance points that I'm encountering when I just do that. If I do, again, a polishing bob, polish, and I'm going to be going in this area of the frame and just polishing those edges, obviously without the trigger in. And we'll just demonstrate that actually here. So with polish on the polishing bob with a Dremel tool, I would come down into this area on the sides here, and then I would come in the rear area just this way and on both sides, and just like that. And what you're going to find is if you do have anything that is in your model that's causing you any kind of a conflict or any kind of a resistance at this point, now's the time to go ahead and find out about it and take care of it. Okay, the next step, we're going to be fitting the magazine eject assist spring. Okay, back for step 3. And what I'm doing now is I'm just replacing that trigger pin with a 3/32 pin punch. Now we're going to take our magazine eject assist spring, and this is going to be rather easy because we don't have anything else in the way right now. You're going to get a chance to see how this spring is oriented in its home. And what I've done, and hopefully we're going to be able to capture this on the video, and if I had an unmagnetized pin punch, it would work even better. Okay, here's what I've done is that center coil of that magazine eject assist spring is now just above my pin punch. The tail end is here. The head end is up in the front of the trigger guard area. Now watch what I'm going to do. I'm going to just retract my punch, and I'm going to press down on those center coils and slip my pin punch right back through like that. Now I'll be able to go ahead and follow the pin punch back out as a kind of like a slave pin and put my trigger pin back in. And I grant you, it's not going to be as easy, you know, with that trigger pin. If it's got a tight fit to it, you don't have to go all the way in with it. You just need to have it through the opposite side of the trigger when you put it in. Okay, now what we've done is we've positioned our magazine eject assist spring. And what you're going to notice, and what you should notice, let's see if we can get a look at that. Okay, so what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to light this up and show you the proper positioning of the magazine eject assist spring there in its home. One thing I just noted is the actual positioning when we do the final install, that spring, the head end of it up here is going to kind of be over to the right like it is. And at this point, you're going to feel some resistance offered by that magazine eject spring on your trigger. And it's actually going to make your trigger work almost like a trigger return spring was involved. But what I want to show you is when we put our magazine in, this is what we're really going for. Now, we'll see if we can find a better way to show that. There we go. Now we see the tail end of that magazine eject assist spring is on top of the magazine housing. It's also clear of our magazine. This is where probably you will need to do some adjustment of this tail end, and it's very, very easy. We've made it very easy at this point because you don't have anything else installed in the trigger. Getting this magazine eject assist spring right back out the same way, running a pin punch through where is now your trigger pin, and you're going to be able to just lift this right back out. And what is very good about the adjustment that you're looking at here is you're going to see that, first of all, the magazine eject assist function is very good, and that happens when you hit your mag release. It causes, we're just going to see if we can show the actual function of it. It causes that magazine eject assist spring to want to unwind, which causes that. We'll see that again. Okay, that's how it works. What's good about the adjustment here is we don't have much, if any, contact with the side of the frame with the magazine eject assist spring. What you must be able to do is have that go fully up and fully back without that spring interfering with the frame and causing resistance on the trigger going back forward. The other thing I wanted to show you is everything is all right when we've taken that resistance off of that trigger. The magazine disconnect spring now is not in touch with the trigger, and take a look at the trigger. Just beautiful. No resistance. The magazine eject assist spring with the magazine in does not cause any effect. It has no effect. You can see the trigger is completely floating. However, when we eject the magazine, now it does offer some resistance to the trigger. What that means is with this magazine eject assist spring in use, when the magazine is out, if the trigger is pulled, the trigger is going to feel heavier, and that is feedback that you don't have a magazine in your handgun, and if you're needing to spend a last shot that's in the barrel, you're spending it. So you will feel it when the trigger return spring is in here in a few moments. You'll feel it when the magazine is out. However, when the magazine is in, that magazine eject assist spring is literally going to have no effect. And you know, you take it in, you take it out, and here's the magazine eject assist spring. So if I brought that back out of the pistol and wanted to make an adjustment, I want to imagine that this angle is too sharp. I need to come back this way to clear the frame. So I'm just saying that if that is the case, as an example, it's quite easy to do that. Just hold the spring like this, and then take another pair of pliers or a needle nose, and you're just going to come out with the spring, bending it out that way. So if I was in contact with the frame, I get not in contact with the frame by just putting a little bit of a bend back this way. Then, as the spring in this pistol that you just saw, we actually came back like this, and we just put about halfway up. We just put another slight bend by coming this way, and you just go a little bit at a time. There are so many variables and differences in high power frames, the forged, the cast. There are so many differences. There's just not a possibility of a one size fits all spring. However, what you're seeing right here is, first of all, when you first install it, you may need some fitting automatically. What makes this fit job here so good and it was only two little alterations to that tail. What I've got is I've got Sear contact on top of the magazine housing, and the spring is completely out of the way of the follower. There's no issue or contact there, and we have good function, and we have good complete reset without interference with that tail. So at this point, this magazine eject assist spring is completely fitted, and we're going to go on to the next step. Okay, so now we have fitted our magazine eject assist spring, and it is time to install our trigger. I have installed the trigger return spring here. I went ahead and used a scroll pin because I happen to know that I'm going to be staying with this particular spring choice. So I did go ahead and use the scroll pin in this instance and permanently mounted it. And now it's time to go ahead and we're going to slip this trigger back up into the frame. And more than seeing how this is done, this is almost more like feeling how it's done, but that there is how it's done. Now, once I've gotten into this position where I've got my trigger return spring is up here in the area we call the trigger well area. There we go. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the trigger rearward. And we're going to go ahead and introduce the trigger lever. Trigger lever, you remember how that tip goes to the right. So we're going to go down at the correct angle, orienting the spring over the trigger lever. Now we are to this point. Now all I need to do is I'm going to go ahead and encourage the trigger return spring upwards and up to on top of the trigger well area, just like that. Now from here, we're going to go ahead and grab a 3/32 pin punch. We'll go ahead and hold the trigger in place with a pin punch, and everything right now seems just absolutely excellent. And we don't have the magazine eject assist spring in yet, and we're going to actually come back to that. So I'm going to go ahead and with my very friendly trigger pin, I'm going to go ahead and bring the pin in because I want to check a couple things at this point. I want to check the height of the trigger lever, and I will tell you, based on what you're seeing right here, that really is right at the optimal point right there. On the FN Brownings especially, you can kind of eyeball this, and what I'm talking about is you have this ridge right here, and usually a trigger pawl height just above that ridge and not above the frame. If you're up here and you're getting too close to the top of the frame, you won't introduce the slide into the pistol at that point. So this height really is looking quite good. And so we're going to go ahead and attempt to introduce our slide on, and we are clear. If you ever do put the slide on and you start coming back this way and it starts to get hung up, drop your trigger pin back out and let the trigger lever come down, and then remove your slide, and you're going to need to make a height adjustment on that trigger lever. We're going to talk about that here right now. I have an Arcus 94. We've brought it to about the same stage of the trigger install, and you see how much more exaggerated the height is. In fact, the back end of this trigger lever is right there at the top of the frame height. And in fact, when we try to put the slide on, the slide is going to stop, the trigger pawl, I'm sorry, is going to stop the slide at that point. So this will require adjustment. We're going to show that here in just a couple minutes. Back to our FN. So we're going to go ahead and just try a few snaps with that trigger. We do have about that much take up. Whoops. Take up, brake, and just a little over travel. This is actually kind of ideal in the Type 1, is to have your trigger travel on the front end, then the brake, and then as you hold the trigger, you want to feel just a little movement in your trigger finger. And we'll be getting into explaining about why that is. But this is really optimal for the design in the Type 1 Sear lever models. So I'm going to go ahead and take a quick trigger brake weight test on this and see where we come out. And we're about 5 1/8. So really right in the bullseye range for me. So we've got our trigger installed in this one. We can move on to the magazine eject spring, but before we do, this is where you'll have one other fit point. This is going to be very individual from high power to high power, but that fit point is right here. And what we're looking at is, this will be the position of the barrel during recoil. I think we can see it now, and you assume that the trigger is pulled. And so that is our picture. What we don't want to see is, we don't want to see any encroachment of the trigger lever into the chamber area, into the ejection port area ideally, but definitely not into the round circumference of the chamber area. If you have, say, example, a barrel designed like this, you have a little bit different perspective, but you have the same issue. And the issue here is just barely the edge of that trigger lever is encroaching into the chamber. In the old design triggers, in the old design trigger levers, the angle at the top of the trigger lever is just like this. You see this angle here on this side. That is so you don't have interference with the barrel. Again, there's no one size fits all for the adjustment on this part, and it's not science. I'm going to go back to the BH barrel, which will be the permanent barrel in this particular high power, and we're going to see just at that top corner, and that's not much. Just on that top corner, we're getting into the circumference, or just into the outer edge of this radius right in here. So that's going to require just a small amount of fitting, and I'm going to show you the quick and easy way that I've come to do it. However, when you do it this way, you need to have an air compressor if you're going to make this adjustment with the pistol in the gun, just to get any small shards of metal back out. But this is one way of doing it. And I have to tell you, I'm almost completely satisfied with that result, and I'm hoping that that's going to show up well for the camera. That really is good. And I've also avoided making the top of the trigger lever a point. In other words, it is still a flat surface. Also, you can see the what was done with that trigger lever here on this side, and that trigger lever is fitted at this point. Very good result. Okay, so now we're back to step next. I want to show you on this Arcus. You'll remember on the FN that we put in, the trigger lever just seemed to magically be at the right height. That was already fitted that way to be the right height. And I wanted to show you what you're going for. There are some high powers where no fitting may be necessary, and it may not be necessary to do what we're going to show you what we're going to do right now. But this is one of the keys to having the best possible trigger pull in the high power pistol is the fitting of this trigger lever. So I'm going to do it the way that I often have done it on my own high powers. A safer way to do this is outside the gun. I'm pulling the trigger, holding the trigger lever up at this point, and I'm going to come at it from this direction. I want you to notice I'm going to hold the angle on the top of the trigger lever, and we're just going to go ahead and reduce the height. And we're going to stop. We are definitely probably not far enough down yet, but you do want to just go slow on this. And no, we're still not going to clear the slide. Now we're getting really, really close. In fact, that's starting to look really good as far as the height. Make sure that we show this. So hopefully you can see, the height. The ridge is a little different with the top of the frame on the Arcuses than on the FNs, but generally it works about the same. This slide should now install. And it does. We have good clearance in that respect. Now we're going to go ahead and pop in the barrel and the recoil spring guide rod, and we will see how well we did here. Now you're going to notice I have very, very little take up in this trigger. Initially, you may think that's a good thing. That's not all a good thing, and I'll show you why here in a second. You see the amount of trigger travel we have here, plus we have a trigger lever that's not currently resetting. Now it has reset. But what I want you to notice is when I pull this slide back, watch my finger. My finger moved back kind of radically, and now you see how deep it is in the trigger guard area, and we're not resetting. So what that's telling me is we have not brought that trigger lever down far enough. The problem with a trigger that is like this, other than the fact that the trigger lever is not yet getting low enough to successfully reset reliably, but all of our trigger range is in the follow part of the trigger pull. So in the take-up portion, we're very short. We have the brake, but then the over travel past the brake, and watch my finger move. See that? Perfect. That is trigger travel that your finger and your reflexes will have a hard time interpreting because it's happening at the same time as the explosion of the cartridge and the recoil and other stimuli. So we want to get more of the trigger travel here on front, and it's going to help with that non-resetting trigger lever when we do also. So we're going to bring the height of that trigger lever down just a bit more. Okay, now I'm going to give you a glimpse of the height that we've gotten it to now. And we're going to see the effect on the action of the trigger next. So now we see a little bit more take up, a little less over travel, And right out at the end of our trigger travel, we have the reset. Now I'm going to massage this just a little bit more, because for me that reset is just a bit late and I still have quite a bit of travel. You'll notice after the break it's really more than I need. So I'm going to go ahead and trim the height of that trigger lever down just a little more. Now I'll give you a perspective on this. Now you'll remember I told you this little ridge right here, it's different because we're actually now just below that ridge, and that would actually be too low in an FN, but it's not in an Arcus. But the way to find out where you're at, put the slide back on. Now we're going to see again. Now we're seeing more take up. That's a good thing. Brake. Less over travel now. And we're getting a little bit earlier reset. In other words, the trigger's not having to travel quite all the way forward. On this one, I'm actually going to trim the height of that down just a little more, and it's going to be perfect at this point. And now we have that much for take up. Our brake, just a little over travel, just right for a Type 1 Sear lever, and our reset. And you're going to notice that our reset is happening just a little earlier now, right there. And we still have a little bit of trigger travel after the reset. And that should be really nice trigger. We're going to take a quick read on this one as well and see where we're at. This one we're braking at 4.5. So as you can see there. Okay, the last thing we need to do on that trigger lever is we're now going to check how are we doing with the trigger lever and its relationship with our barrel. Now, isn't that interesting? Now you're going to see that the height of our trigger lever just about is at the top of the, let's see if we can show you a height of it just like that. Just beautiful, perfect. Now we're going to take a look at it from this direction, and I've got just a little corner there, right there, and I want to go ahead and get that cleaned up, and we'll just go ahead and do that right now. Now we're going to see really nice. That's just right there outside the edge of the circumference. The height is good, and this is now just a very nicely fit trigger in this Arcus 94. And now that we have our trigger lever and trigger return spring installed, we've adjusted the height, and we've filed off the edge there that's nearest the barrel chamber. Now it's time to just check on the positive positioning of the trigger lever and its control by the trigger return spring. To do that, we're just going to pull up on the trigger. Now we've not installed the magazine eject assist spring at this point, but we're going to just check this. And the way we do that is pull the trigger, pull the trigger lever forward, just like the Sear lever does when the slide comes forward. Release that and then let it go with your finger. And it should move right to the rear position with authority, just as you just saw it. It does on that one. And then we've got the Arcus frame here, and very same effect. And it goes down and it goes right to the rear position. Another nuance I wanted to show you, you know the Arcus 94 frame. This is Bulgarian and a lot like the Korean Mark 2 and 3. And you see how effortlessly I just installed that trigger into this Arcus. In other words, getting it up in here different. You see the dimensional difference here between this and the FN Browning. That's the reason why we've got to be so careful with the Brownings, is because we do have a smaller trigger guard area than, frankly, a lot of the other high power clones. Okay, next we're going to take on the subject of the Type 1 and Type 2 Sear levers. And the Type 1 Sear lever is the original Sear lever in the high power pistol. On or around 1989 or so, FN and Browning started making a model called the Mark III or the Mark IIIS. And that included a drop safety Sear lever, and it's right here. The Type 1 Sear lever looks just like this. You see me pushing it back and forth. That Sear lever is floating. There's no positive positioning about it. And the Type 2 Sear lever has a spring under it right here, and it is positively positioned. It's also affirmatively blocking the firing pin. So those are the two main functional characteristics, differences of those two Sear levers. But what we want to talk about is specifically what you can kind of expect reasonably from one or the other. To give you an idea of what happens here, trigger gets pulled, the trigger pawl rises, and it meets an engagement point. You can see that it's actually shiny right there, and it presses down. You see this other end of the lever rise, and when that happens, it will engage the Sear here, and if the trigger is pulled sufficiently, it will cause the hammer to go forward just like that. When the side slide cycles, the slide clears that relationship of the trigger pawl and the Sear lever, so it begins rearward, and it clears. And when it clears, any additional movement of the trigger we call over travel. When the slide comes back rearward, we assume that the trigger is in the position like this, and that Sear lever here, the front edge of the Sear lever, not the top up here, but the front edge of the Sear lever, engages that trigger lever, pushes it forward, and when the trigger is released, the trigger pawl comes down and then comes back to the rear. When the Type 1 Sear lever slide comes forward, this is also the engagement area with the back of the trigger lever here. And it does the same thing, but the only one difference is it's not positively positioned, and you don't have any control over its positioning. And for that reason, we always recommend some degree of over travel past the break point on Type 1 Sear lever pistols. And I'm going to say that again because that's very, very important information. Always recommend a degree of over travel, at least a little bit, on Type 1 Sear lever high powers. And primarily the reason is to avoid the potential for more than one round being fired per trigger pull. That's the main kind of a risk. And again, it's because this Sear lever is not positively positioned. So when the trigger lever is pulled, or the trigger is pulled, the trigger pawl goes upwards. What I'm looking for is just a little bit of movement of my trigger finger, and the amount of movement in this particular trigger is going to be rather imperceptible to the camera, but I can feel it in my finger. When the slide begins rearward and the Sear lever clears the trigger, I can feel it clear in my finger, which means there is a degree of over travel coming rearward. This Arcus has more exaggerated over travel. We're going to be taking that out here in a minute, but you're going to be able to see it, what I'm talking about, even more. And that's really not a bad thing. It's a nice margin in the system, if you will. However, that over travel is a difficult thing to time, and for your reflexes to understand. My finger understands the movement that happens before the explosion. And then after the explosion and the slide comes rearward and I feel the recoil while all that's happening, I don't always have a good perception of how much more right there did my finger move and how far forward is the reset. So the thinking is that you want more movement up here on the front end. And you remember this Arcus, early on, we had almost no take-up whatsoever. Now we've gotten some take-up in there. We've trimmed down the over travel. One point I want to make real clear to you is this, is nothing that we're doing with the height of the trigger pawl has anything to do with the overall. I can show you with this trigger here just a little bit better, but this is the BH advanced trigger subassembly as well, in a gold-plated version. But my point, I show it to you this way to make a point. You see, when I pull the trigger rearward, the front stop right up here stops the trigger movement. And when the trigger is released, the back stop here stops the trigger movement. The total range of that movement, I calculated about 4 millimeters-ish. And I'll show you how I measured that. This is not a scientific way to measure this by any means, but we're at about 61.4, it looks like. Now I'm going to just simply bring the trigger back just like that, and we're about 57.4. It's about 4 millimeters. That 4 millimeters of total trigger travel, you're not going to add to it or take away from it by filing down this trigger pawl as we have. In other words, there's no slide on this trigger pawl, and the height of it has nothing to do with anything right now. The total trigger travel in the high power is what it is. What you have seen as we kept trimming down this Arcus trigger lever is you saw more travel on the front end, or more travel on the take-up area, and we're reducing travel on the over travel area. And I'm actually going to trim this down just a little bit more and take some more off of the over travel, put some more in the front end of the take-up. Your Type 2 models, and this is a Type 2 Sear lever model here. And you see, there's the trigger travel on the take-up. There's the brake. And watch my finger. There's nothing. Literally no over travel whatsoever. There's the total trigger travel. It's still the 4 millimeters, plus or minus, but I'm able to put all of the trigger travel on the front end and have no over travel. But again, it's that Type 2 positively positioned Sear lever that makes it safe. To do that. So there is a discussion about the Type 1, the Type 2. You can have virtually or no over travel in the Type 2 Sear lever models. That same profile is not safe in the Type 1 Sear lever models. You need a degree of over travel, a little bit of intelligible movement of the trigger after that Sear lever clears the trigger pawl. And that's the main thing that we wanted to key in and focus in on in this part of the trigger installation. Okay, now before we move on to the magazine eject assist spring, I want to stay focused on this Arcus 94. This has turned out to be a good learning tool for us for the BH Advanced Trigger Subassembly. It's not such a drop-in affair as much as the FN kind of was, and so we're going to kind of stick with it. Where I'm going with this right now, a couple places. We have the 0.75, that's the second strongest trigger return spring in here, and the SFS system, and I had been using an optimized Sear spring in here for quite some time. This is it, and I had about a 4.5 pound trigger pull. So a couple different ways I could address that, and what I mean by address that is for a handgun that I'm going to carry some. 4.5 pound trigger pull is just a little lighter than what I like to go. 5 to 5 3/4 is just about bullseye perfect for me, but getting into the 4s, especially with a 9mm wide trigger, that's just a little bit on the light side. So replaced the Sear spring with the Type 2 stronger Sear spring. And that brought the trigger break weight up just a tick over 5 pounds, and which was actually, I think it was more like about 5.5. We're going to see that here in a second. But I'm still not real pleased with the amount of over travel with this trigger. And I'm going to try to give you a good objective look right here. Just watch my finger and how much it moves when I clear the trigger pawl with the Sear lever with the slide moving. Yeah, that's a little much. Still, not bad. We're getting there. In fact, we're running out of over travel at this point. We're going to go ahead and get a trigger break weight scale check for you here. Yeah, just right at, we'll see there, 5 5/8. So that was the difference that the Type 2 Sear spring made. We added margin back to this pistol by doing that, and the trigger just feels fantastic. I'm just a little bit still not digging that amount of over travel there is after the trigger break. So we're going to make one, hopefully, final adjustment. And when you've watched me doing this, you've seen me, I'm pulling up or pulling backwards on the trigger to bring the trigger lever safely up here to where I can work on it. And by the way, anytime that you work with the with everything in the gun like this, last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take compressed air and I'm going to blow all this out before I try to shoot with it, or just detail strip it and do a deep cleaning on it one way or another. Okay, let's see where our trigger response is now. You've watched that trigger take up get larger and larger as we've gone. There's the break. Now let's see the amount of over travel we have left. I'll tell you, that's at the point I'm going to go ahead and leave that alone now. That's really pretty good. Just a little bit, and that's really just ideal. That's really just what we want. So this Arcus, the formula, whether you're Type 1 or you're Type 2 Sear lever, the formula is always going to stay the same. You install the trigger and the trigger lever, and you have to bring the height down. If the slide doesn't install, You have to bring down the height of that trigger lever until the slide installs. Then you want to check and see, okay, where's my trigger travel? All these triggers are going to have 4 to 5 millimeters of available trigger travel for you. And as you bring the height of that trigger lever down gradually, you are adding it to the front end like this, and you're taking it away from the back end, which is right here. And now you see we just have just enough movement to kind of know that it's there, but not bad at all. And so this has turned out to be a good learning tool. There is one last nuance of one particular FN and Browning model, and it's the Mark IIIs with the cast frames. And I'm going to show you that little nuance. In fact, I'm going to let you hear it. Here, right at the bottom of the, when I pull the trigger back, it's just kind of a funny sound. There is a casting mark that appears to be very consistent. Take a look at where the front stop of the trigger is, and that is right here, right along the trigger well area. And where we're going with that is right over here on the side, right under this trigger lever area there is a little ledge, and it's almost invisible, but it's there. And right there on the you can hear it, the edge of the trigger is catching that, just barely contacting it. The solution to that is going to be to file or Dremel off just this edge, the outside edge of the front stop, and just again right along that edge. And it won't take much, and you will be clearing that, and it won't be any more of a sound. Okay, folks, we are back, and we are ready for the final turn toward home here in the BH Advanced Trigger Subassembly. This is the FN high power we started out with, the tan one, hoping that we'd be able to see things a little bit better. Now this time we're putting the magazine eject assist spring in. This is the one we fitted very early on, like step 1. And now we're going to install it. Everything else is in good order, and we're ready to do this final step. I want you to watch how I put this in. There's no magic good way to do this. That's why we wanted you to fit it with everything else out. It's a little bit pesky in some models, but what I've done here right now is I've oriented it in about the best position that I can to bring this the rest of the way in. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get a rather small pin punch, and what I'm going for is the center coils. And what I've done is I've made this look much easier than it is actually. But that is the idea of exactly what you need to do, is lay that spring on its side. Sometimes you'll have to get another pin punch right here and kind of massage it around the trigger lever. That way that I just did it was embarrassingly easy, because normally it's not that easy for me. And that's why I recommend doing that, fitting that magazine eject assist spring very first thing. Now all I'm going to do here is, in fact, I'm going to turn this around and we'll have a better video of this, I think. There we go. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get around top of those center coils, kind of keep that spring in position as I withdraw just like that. Now, I'm going to take a look at the positioning of my springs inside here. And I am going to make a little adjustment here. We're going to get the mag eject assist spring over here where it's going to live harmoniously with everything else in the gun. There we go. I'm going to check that one time with the real magazine before we button that up. And yeah, zoom here. So far it's looking like everything is just where we would like for it to be. And it's time to go ahead and we're going to grab a new trigger pin this time. And we should have a little bit tighter relationship with things with that in place. Grab a trigger pull scale here, and well, I'll tell you, it's consistent. 5 and 5/8. And of course, as you know, as you've read the literature in the packaging, we could trim this easily down to probably 4 pounds. If that's what we want to do with the lightest possible trigger return spring, the lightest possible Sear spring. But I'm setting these up for personal use, actually, for carry and for home defense. And all of them that we've set up so far here have been 5 to 5 3/4 pounds, and very consistently right around that 5 1/2, and very, very happy with that. And oh, one more thing I wanted to show you. That is, we mentioned early on, with that magazine out, now I have the resistance of the magazine eject assist spring. My trigger pull is a little bit noticeably heavier. Don't think it's 5 1/2 pounds anymore. And it's not. It's a little bit over 6 1/2 pounds. Of course, that goes right back down when you have a magazine in. But that's feedback to your finger that you don't have a magazine in your pistol when you feel that heavier, especially the take-up part. The take-up part is noticeably heavier. And again, we are just consistent as we can be at that number. So, folks, good luck. Hope you enjoy the BH Advanced trigger sub-assembly for high-power pistols with magazine eject assist. And hopefully these tutorial sessions here answered a lot of questions for lots of folks who are in the process of fitting this. And good luck to everybody.